Welcome to a new volume of scary stories to fall asleep to. We've got all manner of scary bedtime stories here, but let's start out with a creepy canine tale first. And we call this one The Strange Dog-Headed Man. As I walked through the dark woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves sent shivers down my spine. I quickened my pace, hoping to make it home before anything can happen. But then I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was a low, guttural growl, like that of a wild animal. I turned around, and my heart stopped in my chest. There, standing in the shadows, was the figure of a man. But this was no ordinary man. His head was that of a snarling dog, teeth bared and eyes glowing in the darkness. He stood perfectly still, watching me intently. I couldn't move. It was as if my feet were rooted to the spot. The dog-headed man took a step forward, and I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I tried to run, but my legs felt heavy and uncooperative. As he closed in, I could smell the stench of wet fur and rotting meat. I couldn't move. It was as if my feet were rooted to the spot. The dog-headed man took a step forward, and I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. His growls grew louder, more menacing. I could practically feel his hot breath on my skin. I stumbled and fell to the ground, my heart racing in my chest. The dog-headed man towered over me, his eyes blazing with fury. He opened his mouth, a deep growl rumbling from deep within his chest. In that moment, I knew I was done for. But then, something miraculous happened. A ray of moonlight broke through the trees, casting a glow around the creature. His eyes softened, and he let out a mournful howl before turning and disappearing back into the darkness. What had I just witnessed? I can't tell you what that was that happened, but if it hadn't, I feel that the creature would have finished me off. I lay there for a moment, gasping for breath. It took me a few moments to gather myself and stand up. Somehow it didn't feel over. And to this day, it still doesn't feel as though it's concluded. With each step I took, I could still feel the weight of the dog-headed man's presence following me home, haunting me long into the night, and possibly for the rest of my life. The Antlered Man, outside my cabin. I had come to the Minnesota woods to escape the city and its commotion. The solitude and silence were everything I wanted, but there were times when it was almost overwhelming, especially at night, when the dark woods seemed to hold secrets that no one could know. During the day, I explored the forest, taking long walks and admiring the beauty of the wildlife and vegetation. One night, after a long day, I sat inside my cozy cabin, reading a book by the fire. I was feeling at peace with the world, when the sudden sound of rustling outside broke the stillness. I looked up from my book and I peered out the window, expecting to see a curious animal. Instead, I found myself staring at a creature with the body of a man and the antlers of a deer, rummaging through my woodpile. My heart leaped in my chest. The creature fixed me with cold, black, inhuman, unblinking eyes. As I watched, frozen, from behind the window, it snorted, then tossed aside a log, taking no further notice of me. The humanoid creature reached for another piece of firewood and studied it, examining it with skilled eyes. But what he was looking for, I do not know. It was then that I could see the creature's tall, slender build. Its arms were twisted, its joints contorted, in a way that made me cringe. For a moment, I thought about calling out to it, but the words died on my lips. The creature was not something I could communicate with or understand. Its movements were too inhuman, too alien. I felt a cold breeze, even though the cabin windows were all shut. The humanoid creature tossed the wood onto the woodpile, dropped to all fours, which looked unnatural given its humanoid build, then turned to go, starting away on all fours, the antlers bobbing up and down into the darkness. I waited until it was out of sight. Then I bolted the door and windows tight. For the rest of that night, I sat in the silent cabin, keeping vigil, wondering what other strange beasts might be lurking in the wilderness around me. I left the next morning, and since then, I take vacations in heavily populated areas. The Howling, in the basement. My husband and I rented a beautiful house in a small town. It wasn't long before we noticed that something was off. Sometimes, in the quiet of the night, we could hear a faint, mournful howling coming from our basement. At first we thought it was just the old house settling, or a passing car outside. But the howling didn't stop. It persisted, night after night, growing louder and more intense. It was a sound that seemed to emanate from deep within the basement of the house. One night, we decided to investigate. We made our way down to the cellar, following the sound of the howling. As we descended the stairs, the sound grew louder and more chilling until it was almost overwhelming. But when we reached the downstairs door to the basement, the howling abruptly stopped. We exchanged nervous glances, but slowly opened the door anyway. We peered inside the dark, musty basement, but there was no sign of anything out of the ordinary. Just a few old boxes of discarded belongings, some disused garden tools, and a furnace in the corner that rattled occasionally. After a few minutes of searching, we found nothing that could have caused the howling. We shrugged it off and returned to go upstairs to bed, but the howling started up again as soon as we started making our way back up. It was like the basement was hiding something deep and mysterious from us. The next few weeks were filled with restless nights. We stopped going down to the cellar and tried our best to ignore the howling. But it continued, and we started to worry that the house might be haunted by something sinister. In the end, we decided to move out, too spooked by the howling to stick around and find out what might be the source of it. We never did find out what was making that mournful sound, but to this day, it gives me chills just thinking about it. The man in my bathroom. I woke up with a start, feeling the urge to empty my bladder. The clock read 3 a.m. as I stumbled to the bathroom still half asleep. I quickly did my business in the dark and turned on the light to wash my hands when I saw him. A man, standing completely unmoving, facing the wall in my bathroom. His back was to me, and he seemed transfixed on a point on the wall. My heart raced as I took a step back, afraid to make any noise and alert him to my presence. I tried to rationalize what I was seeing, thinking that maybe it was someone who had gotten lost or confused, and had accidentally stumbled into my house. But then I noticed that there was something off about him. He was completely still, like a statue. I couldn't even see him breathing. I whispered, "Hello?" But he didn't respond. I didn't want to get any closer, so I slowly backed out of the bathroom. As I turned to walk back to my room, I swear I could feel his eyes on my back. But I couldn't bring myself to turn around and confirm that. I ran to my bedroom, and I locked the door behind me, feeling a cold sweat breaking out. I didn't know what to do. I picked up my phone to call the police, but for some reason, I thought they would call me crazy and hang up on me. So I just stayed there, listening to the sound of my own racing heart and the silence that had descended over the house. Eventually, the light began to peek through the blinds, and the morning birds began their song. I was hungry, and I needed to start my day, but I was too frightened to leave my room. The combination of sunlight and hunger made me braver. And I finally called the cops, waiting for them to arrive. When they got there, they searched the entire place, and there was no other person there besides me. I don't know what happened to the man in my bathroom, but I never forget the feeling of his presence. It was like whatever was in that bathroom that night had some kind of a power over me, and I never want to experience that again. My grandma's house seems to be haunted. My grandmother's house had always been a cozy haven for me. The scent of freshly made cookies, comfortable beds, and the sound of rain pattering against the windows made it a perfect refuge. As a child, I'd spend hours running around the house, peeking into every nook and cranny. But as I grew older, I began to notice something odd about the place. One late evening, I was staying in my grandmother's house alone, catching up on work I had brought with me. Everything was fine until I heard the sound of someone walking down the hallway, on the creaky wooden floor that I knew so well. I could hear footsteps approaching my room, but I couldn't see anyone through the partially open door. I assumed it was my grandmother and I called out to her, but when no one answered, I began to feel uneasy. I got up and walked toward the open door. I looked out into the hallway, and there was no one there. Shivering, I went back into my room and closed the door, not wanting to be out in the open where something could be lurking. It was then that I saw him, or rather his reflection, in the mirror. A young boy, covered in dirt, his eyes cold and lifeless. I couldn't scream. I couldn't move. I just stood there with my back pressed against the door, staring at that reflection. I knew that it was a ghost, and I knew that it was haunting my grandmother's house. The unease turned into full-fledged fear as I heard faint giggling coming from the darkness. Suddenly the room temperature dropped drastically, and I felt something brush against my arm. That was the moment I had to take action. I bolted out of that room, feet pounding on hardwood floor as I made my way toward the front door. It was unlocked, and I pushed it open, running out into the cold, dark night. When I looked back, the windows of the house were fogged up, and I could see the ghost of a young boy staring at me through the glass, watching me leave. I never went back to that house again. The memory of that night still sends shivers down my spine, and I wonder if the ghost of that young boy is still there, haunting my grandmother's house. The gnome who lived in our fireplace. My husband and I had just moved to an old stone cottage, and we were enamored with the roaring fireplace that worked so beautifully on cold autumn evenings. But we had one problem. We couldn't seem to keep the chimney clean. One evening, as we were struggling with yet another load of soot, we heard a tiny foul-mouthed voice coming from somewhere deep in the fireplace. We both froze, unable to believe what we were hearing. But the voice persisted, cursing and spitting out insults like a sailor. We tried to ignore it, telling each other that we had to be imagining it. But the voice continued, getting louder and more persistent with each passing day. Eventually, we realized that we were not alone in our cottage. When we found the thing urinating inside our refrigerator one day, it cursed a blue streak and ran back toward the fireplace, where I swear, with my own eyes, I saw him enter into a sliver between two stones and slide into a space far too small for him to have ever possibly fit. We both gasped at the sight of that, and we knew we were not in Kansas any longer. The two of us had a discussion about it, and our conclusion was that there was a foul-mouthed gnome living in an alternate dimension that he entered into through the stones of our old fireplace, and we got there using Occam's razor, too. This gnome was tiny, barely the size of a tennis ball, but he was more than a match for the two of us. He had a piercing voice that could make our ears bleed, and he could curse like no human being ever could. For weeks we tried to make peace with the gnome, to understand what he wanted and why he was there. But no matter what we did, that gnome only grew angrier and more vicious. He would hurl insults, threats, and curses at us, all day and all night, completely unyielding. We contacted several so-called local paranormal experts, but nobody seemed to know how to deal with gnomes. Eventually, we decided that the only thing to do was to seal off the fireplace for good. It was a tough decision, but we knew we couldn't live with that gnome forever. So we filled it up with stones and cement, hoping the gnome would find somewhere else to live. But sometimes, on cold autumn nights, when the wind howls through the old walls of the cottage, we still hear the faint, foul-mouthed voice in the darkness, reminding us that the creepy, monstrous fellow will never completely leave this place. Are UFOs the afterlife? I was deep in my sleep when I felt something strange happening. It was the middle of the night, and I felt like I was being lifted off my bed, carried into the air by some unseen force. It couldn't have been a dream. This was too real. I tried to scream out, but my throat felt like it had been coated with sandpaper. I was terrified. When I opened my eyes, I was standing inside a strange room that glowed with a blue light. At first I thought I had been kidnapped, but the room was unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was like being on a spaceship from some sci-fi movie. In front of me stood two creatures that I could only describe as aliens. They were tall, thin figures, with elongated arms and fingers. Their eyes were big and black, with no whites or pupils. They didn't look like anything I'd ever seen before. The aliens spoke to me, but I couldn't understand their language. I was filled with fear, wondering what they were going to do to me. I felt a surge of emotions that I had never experienced before. I felt loved, needed, and blessed, all at the same time. Then I looked around and I saw a shocking sight. Every person or pet in my life who had died was now alive again, and happy, standing there in that place with me, trying to get my attention. My grandparents, my parents, my beloved pets, they were all right there beside me, smiling and telling me they loved me and that they missed me. I was in shock to say the least. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I was overcome with joy and sadness all at once. I knew I was supposed to be happy, but my entire worldview was now turned upside down. When the aliens spoke now, I understood them easily. They explained to me that they had seen humans as a species that struggled with grief and regret. In their own words, they said, "We have come to help you see what might be possible if you could experience things outside your current perception." I was in a moral quandary. On the one hand, I was hesitant to accept such a gift. On the other hand, I couldn't stop seeing everyone I'd ever loved smiling back at me, so happy to see me. In the end, I knew I couldn't stay in that world forever. I had to return to my life, the life without them, to make new memories with everyone else who was still alive. I hugged each of those people I missed so badly, weeping uncontrollably, but knowing it had to be done. I said goodbye to each of them one more time, and thanked the aliens for their gift. They nodded, And that's all I remember. I woke up the next morning, unsure of what had happened to me the night before. But it was an experience I would never forget, one that reinforced my sense of the interconnectedness of all things, even across the vastness of space and the chasm lying between life and death. Some people tell me it was just a dream, but they can't feel how entirely changed my life has been since that incident. I know I will see those I've lost again, and that gives me a sense of peace as I try to do my best in life. Things feel like they make more sense to me since then, so if it was a dream, I say who cares? I wish this same dream on every one of you, so that you can know the peace that I feel since that night when the aliens reunited me with my loved ones. Incident on Clinton Road. As my boyfriend and I drove down the winding road of Clinton Road in New Jersey, I couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement mixed with fear. This notorious street was rumored to be one of the most haunted places in the country, and we were hoping to witness a ghostly encounter. The sky was dark, and the only source of light came from the car's headlights. As we drove deeper into the woods, the trees grew thicker, casting eerie shadows on the road. Suddenly we saw strange lights in the distance, hovering in the air. We were both stunned, unsure of what to do. Without warning, we were engulfed in a bright white light, and we both felt a strange sensation in our bodies. The next thing I knew, we were parked on the side of the road, with no memory of how we got there. The clock on the car's dashboard showed that 2 hours had passed, but we had no memory of what had happened during that time. Our hearts were racing with fear as we attempted to calm down and assess the situation. As we sat there, we heard strange whispers and saw ghostly apparitions hovering around the car. We were both paralyzed with fear, unable to move or speak. Suddenly, the car's engine started to rumble, and we felt it moving on its own. That was pretty terrifying, and I couldn't help but scream as the car raced out of my control down the road on its own. After what felt like an eternity, the car finally came to a stop. We were both shaking with fear, unsure if we had just experienced something supernatural, or if it was all in our minds. As we drove away from Clinton Road, the car once again under our power, we couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. But the memory of that night still haunts us to this day. We never did get to see a ghost, but we witnessed something far more terrifying than we ever could have imagined. A scary Lover's Lane story. I always loved the woods behind my childhood home. It was a sprawling landscape of towering trees, tangled underbrush, and twisting trails that seemed to stretch on forever. I knew every inch of the forest like the back of my hand, and I would often explore its secrets in the early hours of the morning, when the world was still and silent. But tonight was different. I didn't come here to explore or to play. I came here with my boyfriend Ryan to find some privacy. As we walked deeper into the woods, holding hands and giggling, like the two lovesick teenagers we were, I couldn't help but feel a shiver down my spine. It was a strange feeling, like the woods were alive, and they were watching us. We found a small clearing near the center of the forest, and we set up our picnic basket in the grass. Ryan brought a bottle of wine, and we poured ourselves glasses as we lay down, cuddling close to one another, gazing up at the stars. It was perfect, peaceful, serene, romantic. But as the night wore on, the moon crept higher in the sky, and the sounds of the woods changed. It started with a rustling in the trees, followed by the whisper of leaves on the ground. I could hear the faint crunch of twigs and the ominous growling of some unseen animal. Ryan noticed it too, and we both sat up, huddled together in fear. And that's when we saw it. Lurking on the edge of the clearing, a figure emerged from the darkness. It was tall, impossibly thin, with pale, ghostly skin that seemed to glow in the darkness. Its eyes were hollow black pits, and its mouth was twisted into an unnatural grin. It couldn't move. It couldn't scream. I was frozen in terror as that creature approached us, its arms outstretched, reaching for us. We ran from there, this skinny, dead-looking thing staggering behind us. Trying to catch up, we got in the car as it entered the parking lot and headed toward us. My boyfriend gunned the engine and drove directly at that creature, intending to run it down. And then it was gone. Vanished into thin air, leaving us alone in the cold, dark, and silent parking lot. Ryan and I never spoke of that night again. We tried to pretend it never happened, but we both know that it did. And for years afterward, every time I stepped foot in those woods, I couldn't help but feel a chill run down my spine. The forest was haunted, and we had awakened something that we never should have. That thing that happened to Grandpa. I was with my family, sitting in the living room, visiting my grandfather on his farm. It was a particularly dark and stormy evening. Me and the fam were sitting on the couch, talking about old times and sipping hot cocoa, when all of a sudden, I heard Grandpa call out to me from outside. "Tom, come quick, I need your help," he cried. I quickly got up and rushed outside, but as soon as I stepped out of the door, I realized something was wrong. The wind howled around me, and the rain pelted me in the face as I called out to my grandpa. But there was no answer. I started to walk, and every step I took felt like an eternity. The darkness seemed to be closing in around me, and I could barely see where I was going. I heard my grandpa call out to me again. I followed the sound of his voice, convinced that he was in trouble. I called out to him, and I ran toward the direction of his voice. I turned a corner, and I could hear him right there, but there was still no sign of my grandpa. Suddenly, something brushed past me, making me jump. I whipped around, but there was nothing there. The only thing that remained was the faint sound of my grandpa's voice, which seemed to be coming from the dark woods in the distance. I started to run toward the woods, but as I drew closer, I could sense that something was amiss. And as I entered those woods, I began to shiver uncontrollably. I could hear sticks snapping and leaves crunching, but there was no sign of my grandpa. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I felt something cold and slimy slither across my neck. I jumped and spun around, but again there was nothing to be seen. It was like the woods had come alive and were closing in around me. The sound of my grandpa's voice was still coming from a distance, but there was no way to tell where he was. The woods were like a twisted maze that seemed to go on forever and ever. As I continued to search for my grandpa in the woods, I realized that I had become completely and utterly lost. The rain was coming down hard, and lightning flashed intermittently, illuminating the dense foliage all around. I called out for my grandpa one more time, but there was no response. Suddenly, as if from nowhere, I heard a rustling in the bushes behind me. I spun around to face it, knowing deep down that it was not my grandpa's voice. A cold, hollow laughter filled the woods, and I felt something reaching out to grab me from behind. I gasped as I felt a cold skeletal hand clutch onto my shoulder. Turning around to face my fear, I saw the skeletal form of my grandfather leering at me with a rictus grin. I tried to scream, but nothing came out, and before my eyes, the skeletal form of my grandpa evaporated into the dark woods, leaving me alone and lost, with the sound of his laughter following me. The hole in the basement floor. I had just returned from my week-long vacation, and I was eager to get back to my regular routine. However, upon entering my home, something immediately felt off. It was as if a dark cloud had settled over the place, and a chill ran down my spine. As I made my way to the basement to grab some tools, I noticed something strange. My eyes fell upon a freshly filled-in rectangular hole in the middle of my basement floor. I had never seen it before, and I knew something was incredibly wrong. My heart pounding in my chest, I tentatively approached the hole and peered down at it. The dirt was not still. It was trembling somehow. Something was moving down there under the ground, and that realization made me break out into a cold sweat. Whatever it was trying to break free from that dirt, and I could hear low growling coming from below. I felt a sudden sense of intense fear, as if something was watching me. I spun around, but there was no one in sight. Then, suddenly, something burst from the hole. It was like a sinister apparition rising from the depths of the earth. It was hideous, with glowing red eyes and gnarled, claw-like hands that reached for me. I stumbled backward into a stack of boxes, my heart beating 100 miles a minute. I tried to scream, to run, to do anything to escape the horror before me. But I was frozen in place, paralyzed with fear. The thing cackled, a high-pitched and malevolent sound that filled the basement. It spoke in a voice that chilled me to the core, promising me horrors beyond imagining. Determined to survive, I raced back up the stairs, trying to leave that unholy thing behind me. But it pursued me, its claws ripping through the floor as it emerged from the basement. I ran out in front of my home, causing a neighbor of mine to become concerned. I told him there was an intruder in my house, one who had buried himself in a grave in my basement. My neighbor looked at me as if I needed a psychiatrist, but he called the police for me anyway, when I asked him to. After the cops searched the grounds, they brought me down to the basement and asked me to show them where the floor had been dug up. I was stunned to find the dirt floor in that basement entirely undisturbed. The police did not put me on the kook list or the crank list, but they did send a team around for a wellness check on me later that day. And they convinced me to go see a government shrink, which I advise none of you to ever do. Since that day, I just tell shrinks what they want to hear, and I tell everyone else the truth. I still don't know what was in my basement that day, but I know I didn't imagine it, and I know that I'm not crazy. The invisible critic. I can't shake the feeling that someone else is in my house. Every night I hear a woman's voice, whispering something in an annoyed fashion, and usually I can't quite make it out. It sounds like she's talking about me, but I can rarely tell what she's saying. It's strange, and it's more than a little unnerving. But what's even stranger is that every time I can make out what the voice is saying, she does seem to be talking about what I'm wearing. One night I was wearing my old brown robe when I heard her whisper, "That robe is so old and threadbare. You really should get a new one." Another night I had my favorite cardigan on, and I heard her say, "That cardigan has seen better days. You need a new one." At first I tried to brush it off and tell myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But the more I heard the voice, the more convinced I became that there was actually someone in my house. I started to get scared and paranoid, always keeping an eye out for any sign of an intruder. And then one night, the voice spoke directly to me. I was sitting in my armchair reading a book when I heard her say, "Your slippers are looking pretty shabby these days. Why don't you throw them out and get some new ones?" I froze, feeling a chill run down my spine. It was like the woman was standing right behind me, speaking directly into my ear. Slowly, I turned my head, hoping to catch a glimpse of whoever that was speaking to me. But when I looked around, there was no one there. I got up from my chair and I frantically searched the entire house, but there was no sign of anyone. I was completely alone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was someone there, watching me. To this day, I can't bear to be in my home alone. I started staying with my daughter and her family, afraid to even set foot in my own house. The voice still speaks to me sometimes, but I try to ignore it as best I can. I don't recognize the voice as being anyone I used to know or anything like that. It's not like it's the ghost of my mother or my ex-wife or anything, so I don't understand her concern with my wardrobe. I don't know who she is, and I don't know what she wants from me. And, I admit, I'm terrified to find the answers to any of these questions. What'll you give me? I woke up with a start and felt the heavy weight of confusion gripping my mind. I was in complete darkness, unable to see anything. Where was I? How did I end up here? My heart pounded with fear as I tried to recall the events that led me to this claustrophobic space, but my memory was blank. As if sensing my bewilderment, a raspy voice whispered in the darkness, "What'll you give me?" The voice was deep and chilling, sending shivers down my spine. I tried to respond, but my words seemed to stick in my throat. I had no clue what this voice wanted from me, or who it belonged to. I struggled to rise up, but something was holding me down. I fumbled in the darkness, and I felt cold metal shackles around my wrists. My heart raced, and my mind was ablaze with fear and confusion. Was I kidnapped? Was I in a dungeon? The voice spoke again, sounding impatient and menacing. "What'll you give me?" This time I could sense a note of eagerness in his tone, as if he was waiting for something. My mind was racing to find an answer, but all I could think of was getting out of there alive. What did this voice want from me? And why was I here? Suddenly I felt a cold breeze on my neck and a putrid odor filled my nostrils. I gasped in terror, and I tried to move away, but the chains held me in place. I felt a hand on my shoulder, and the voice spoke again, scraping my ear with its words. "You're not going anywhere, my dear. Not until you give me what I want." Suddenly the darkness was shattered by a blinding light, and I could see the face of my captor. He was grotesque, his eyes glowing with a demonic light. I tried to scream, but my voice was drowned by his laughter. The world faded into darkness again, and I was left alone with his voice, asking me the same question over and over again. "What'll you give me?" The talking plant being. I woke up to a startling sight. A glowing plant-like humanoid standing at the foot of my bed. At first I thought it was some sort of a dream or hallucination, but as I rubbed the sleep from my eyes, the creature remained there, its unearthly glow illuminating my room. I mustered the courage to ask, "What are you?" to which the creature replied, in a garbled language that I couldn't understand. It repeated its words, gradually slowing down until I could make out that it claimed to be a distant relative of a flowering earth plant. This revelation sent a chill through me, as I couldn't wrap my mind around the concept of a plant being able to communicate and exist as a humanoid creature. I nervously asked, "What do you want from me?" The creature responded, "My species is dying, and we need your help to survive." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This glowing plant-like creature was asking for my help? Before I could grasp the situation, the creature reached out and took my hand. Suddenly I was flooded with a vision of a barren wasteland, a world where all plant life had been decimated. The alien creature told me that their planet was once like Earth, full of lush and green forests and flourishing plant life, but due to a catastrophic event, all life was wiped out, except for his one lone species. They had been searching for a way to survive and reproduce ever since, and they believed that the DNA of flowering plants on Earth was their last and only hope. I was dumbfounded, but moved by the creature's plea for help. The alien's hand began to glow, and as it did, I felt my body infused with a strange energy. The alien explained that they had transferred some of their genetic material to me, making me a part of their species and connecting me directly to their desperate plight to survive. As the creature disappeared back into the darkness, I was left alone with a newfound sense of responsibility. I had been chosen to help the alien plant species survive, and if I didn't, their fate would be sealed. The thought of being the only hope for another species is both daunting and terrifying, but I know I have to try, and yet I also realize that I have no idea how to help, or what I can do that would help. I can't get anyone to take me seriously about the situation, and being known as the plant guy has cost me a promotion at my job. If this species truly needs my help, they're going to have to tell me how I can help. Right now, I've lost a lot of credibility, and I sort of need to concern myself with helping me, not some alien species. I wish that creature had never entered my bedroom. There was a gnome in our front closet. I must admit, I never believed in fairy tales or mythical creatures. That was, until the day I saw that weird freaking gnome with my own eyes. It was a quiet afternoon, and I was busy in the living room, knitting away, when I heard the sound of the front door unlocking. It was my husband John returning from work. He was always punctual, which was a blessing, but this time his return was far from ordinary. As he walked in, I saw his expression changed as he moved toward the front closet. I couldn't hear anything unusual, but then all of a sudden, a 10-inch tall white-bearded gnome ran out of that closet and right past both of us, straight out the front door. I was in shock. I rubbed my eyes, thinking it was some sort of hallucination. But when I saw John's expression of pure shock and disbelief, I knew that my mind wasn't playing tricks on me. It was real. There, in the front room of our home, we had witnessed something that most people will never see in their entire lives. We both ran outside trying to see the gnome again, but wherever it had run off to, it was gone. We couldn't see it any place, but we stood there for a while looking around anyway. It seemed to have been waiting for someone to open the front door so he could make a break for it. The creature must have sneaked into our house, and then not have been able to figure out how to get back out. At least, that seemed to make sense to us, based on the way it ran out the door as John came in. I wonder how long it had been trapped inside. And I wonder where it ran off to. From that day on, I couldn't stop thinking about the strange creature that had appeared before us. Was it a sign? If so, was it a good omen or a bad one? And most importantly, why did it come into our home? And then where did it go? Years later, I still have no answers, but I will forever remember that moment in time when I saw something truly magical and unexplainable. It's a moment that I will take with me to the grave. I woke up a different person. I woke up this morning feeling groggy, disoriented, and confused. But soon enough, my confusion turned to fear and anxiety when I realized something wasn't right. For starters, my wife was not next to me. She was gone, as if she had never existed. And when I tried to search for her, I noticed something peculiar. I was in a completely unfamiliar place. None of the furniture, decor, or even the structure of the house matched my own. And what's even stranger was that my parents, who should be retired in their home state, were sitting in the living room, acting like nothing was out of the ordinary. As I tried to make sense of my surroundings, I noticed something else that was off. Everyone was calling me by a different name. It wasn't my own name, and it wasn't even a name I recognized. It was as if a different person had taken over my body somehow. But the confusion didn't end there. When I called my brother on the phone, I was greeted by a woman I didn't recognize. She turned out to be a sister that I didn't used to have, and I wanted to scream in horror. As the day went by, weirder and weirder events occurred. Total strangers acted as if they knew me, despite me having no memory of them at all. And as I tried to convince them of who I really was, everyone just seemed to brush it off like I was joking. They didn't believe that I was who I am. They believed I was this other guy, with a different name and a different life. That entire day was a living nightmare. I felt like I was trapped in a twisted version of my own reality, where everything was the opposite of what it should be. By the end of the day, I was barely holding on to my sanity. I don't know what happened to me or why, but one thing is for sure. I want to go back to my old life, and I want to go as soon as possible, before this eerie and spooky new world becomes my new reality. I saw my own doppelganger. I had been going for early morning jogs for a while now, but this was definitely the first time I had ever felt uneasy at this time of day. The narrow jogging path was situated deep within a forest, and the only source of illumination was the dim glow of the full moon peeking through the trees. I had been jogging for a while, but something felt off. Perhaps it had something to do with the eerie silence, or the distant howling of wolves echoing through the woods. I tried to shake it off, but the feeling of unease only grew stronger as I ran. That's when I saw it, a figure slowly jogging toward me. It took me a couple of seconds to realize what was wrong. The closer this person got, the more I realized that their face was an exact copy of mine. My heartbeat quickened, and I started to slow down. The figure kept closing in on me, and the more I saw of their appearance, the more unsettled I became. Their hair was unkempt, and their eyes looked crazy. But other than that, they were me. They wore the exact same running gear, down to the color of their shoes. It wasn't long before we were facing each other, and my unease turned into full-blown horror at the sight of my doppelganger staring right back at me. We just stood there, staring into each other's eyes, for what felt like an eternity. I didn't know what to do or say, and my words failed me. And then, without saying a word, they turned around and started jogging away, leaving me there, alone with the knowledge that something deeply wrong had just happened. I couldn't shake off the feeling of unease and dread that clung to me, and all I could do was run back home, knowing that I wasn't alone on that dark and twisted jogging trail. Hell got too full. I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone, when our doorbell rang. We weren't expecting anyone, so I was surprised to see two police officers standing on our doorstep. They asked to speak to my parents and seemed hesitant to say why they were there. But eventually they explained that there had been some unusual activity in the area and that they wanted to make sure our whole family would be home that evening. I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease settling over me, and when my parents got back and tried to reassure me that everything was okay, it didn't make me feel any better. We decided to spend the evening watching movies and eating popcorn, trying to forget about the strange visit from the police. But as night fell, and the streetlights flickered on, my anxiety only grew. I just couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I suggested that maybe we should hop in our car and leave, just in case. But my parents thought that was unnecessary. "We'll be fine," they said reassuringly. "The police know what they're doing." But it wasn't until we heard strange noises coming from the cemetery down the street that we realized maybe we should have listened to my suggestion. At first, we thought it was just the wind, but then we saw something emerging from the graves. The first thing I saw was a creature I'd never seen before, with eyes that glowed red, and a body that looked like it was once human. I wanted to scream and run, but I was rooted to the spot, too scared to move. Then, one by one, more of them started to rise from their graves, their once dead bodies coming to life once again. The house was surrounded. My mother pointed out the window to the street, and when I looked where she was pointing, I saw those two officers sitting inside their police cruiser, watching the entire situation, and apparently laughing about it. They wanted to know that we would be home, so they could watch what happened when the cemetery unloaded its cargo out onto the streets. But how had they known this would happen? We huddled together, watching in horror as the dead gathered around us. There was no escape. We were trapped in a nightmare that we never could have imagined. It lasted until morning, too, by which time the dead had either returned to their graves or had moved on somewhere else. We didn't spend time wondering about it, though. We just packed what we could in the car and got out of there while the getting was good. I, for one, will never go back in that town. In fact, I won't even utter the name of that town ever again. If you hate the worst and you love the best, then you're gonna love our CS. Please join me in thanking tonight's executive producer, CS, for making this episode possible. CS gets all our perks, and if you want them too, then listen to what our international TV spokesmongrel Henry Lee Dogman has to say. Hank? Thanks, Biggie. And thanks to all of you for watching this far. If you liked it, please click like. If you'd like to see more of our work, please subscribe. And also click that bell icon if you'd like to be notified when we put out a new episode. To become an executive producer, you can donate to us through the thanks button under each of our videos or through our paypal.me/PeterBernard209 page. To receive cool perks like secret uncensored Dogman episodes far too wild to ever run on this channel, you can become a YouTube channel member by clicking the join button, or join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com. Joining either at the $3 a month level or above gets you access to our over 25 hours of secret uncensored Dogman stories available nowhere else. Do you have a scary story about Dogman or some other kind of high strangeness that happened to you? Let us know by emailing us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com or by leaving us a voicemail message at 804-LA-SCARY. You may need to call back on that one. It cuts off after, I think, 3 minutes. And if you don't want to do any of that stuff, thank you for simply watching to the end. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.